Is it possible that the societies of Bronze Age Central Europe almost 4,000 years ago were using these small metal bars and rings as their money? This was the time of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, the Minoan era on Crete, and the Old Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia. We perhaps wouldn't think of Central Europe in this period as in any way comparable to these famous civilizations. And yet, this was a sophisticated society ruled by powerful kings who were buried in splendour beneath vast mounds with gold jewellery and precious artefacts. Ruling over fertile lowlands, they funded armies and controlled important trade routes and productive mines in the mountains. They also created spectacular wonders like the world-famous Nebra sky disk. Their mines produced enormous quantities of copper, the material that fueled the Bronze Age across the Old World. With the copper they extracted and processed, they created personal ornaments, tools and weapons. And they also cast vast numbers of intriguing metal objects in the shapes of bars and rings. Dating to between about 2000 BC and 1600 BC, these are found buried in hoards right across Central Europe. And some scholars believe that these bars and rings actually functioned as money in this ancient society. But is that really possible? This is over 1,000 years before the first coins in the world were made in the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia. So is it plausible that this Central European society could have been advanced enough to develop a system like this? How did this money function? Why might it have been necessary? And what happened to all this money and to this remarkable society? This is the incredible story of the first money in Bronze Age Central Europe. In carrying out my research for this video, I wanted to get some specific information about the history of money. So I asked Aria how to define money in practical terms. Aria is the built-in AI feature that's unique to Opera, the browser that is the sponsor of this video. Opera One R2 is a fast and redesigned browser packed with integrated features to maximize productivity, integrating music and video playback and new tab capabilities. I'm one of those people who ends up with loads of tabs open at once, but Opera has many ways of keeping them organized, like creating tab groups of similar content. For example, when you open another link from the tab you're currently on, or you can create tab islands yourself, and Opera now adds these subtle underscores called tab traces so you can keep track of your recently visited tabs with a glance. I often find the need to switch back and forth between tabs as I'm reading stuff, but I've been using Opera's split screen feature so I can cross-reference both pages at the same time. There are loads of other features like customizable themes where you can try endless combinations of mode, intensity, animation, sounds, colors, shaders and more to create your own modern and clean work environment. You can also integrate your music streaming services and listen to music while you work. You can pause and skip from the sidebar or pop it out as a floating module you can position wherever you want, even beyond the browser window. So if you're looking for a modern browsing experience, please use the link in the description below to give it a try. Thank you to Opera for sponsoring the video. The early Bronze Age in Central Europe was a time of great change. A group of societies known as the Únětice culture developed after about 2200 BC from a merging of the bell beaker and corded ware cultures, and ended around 1600 BC. Large populations developed in the fertile river valleys, living in farmsteads and small villages, as well as a few larger fortified settlements. The rulers of these societies also controlled the upland regions that were the real source of their wealth. Their mines in the various mountain ranges were extremely productive. The ores were processed and tools and weapons created by craftsmen for use in these chiefdoms and for export to neighbouring societies. The positions of these Central European groups along navigable rivers meant that they facilitated trade between the Baltic and the Mediterranean, and between Western Europe and the steppes in the east. This combination of large lowland populations, mines and craftsmen producing the most valuable resources of the era, and a core position on international trade routes led to these societies becoming extremely wealthy. This wealth was of course concentrated in the hands of the rulers and expressed in impressive burials and huge timber halls. They had so much central control, developing institutions and social practices across the generations, that some scholars see these as state-level or at least proto-state-level societies. This was manifested in central control and distribution of the grain supply and in military organisation. They even perhaps developed systems to keep track of the trade goods being exchanged through their lands. including small clay tokens known as bread loaf idols, as they look a bit like tiny loaves of bread. No one knows for sure, but they might have been used as a way to track goods or payments. This is all to say that these were surprisingly sophisticated societies and major copper production centres. And some of the most common objects found from these societies are two kinds of copper artefacts known as rib ingots and ring ingots. They were produced across the region for centuries in enormous quantities. We know about them largely from their appearance in bronze hoards. These are groups of metal artefacts that were intentionally buried that have then been discovered in modern times. This was a practice carried out across Europe throughout the era, although the nature of the depositions is different in different places and times. Hoards provide an enormous amount of information about the past. The main ways that archaeologists have understood these prehistoric societies has been through excavating and analysing burials, settlements, and also these hoards. Why the owners of these hoards would bury them is much debated. Perhaps they were never meant for retrieval at all, and the items were being sacrificed, given as a gift to the gods. Some have speculated that burying bronze goods was a way of taking them out of circulation when too much had been produced to reduce inflation. Anyway, they're complicated things, and there's almost certainly not a single answer about why they were made. In the early Bronze Age in Central Europe, these hoards often contain axe blades, as well as the two forms of artefacts given the names eyelet rings and clasp bars, but in English they're most commonly known as ring ingots and rib ingots. The rings are versions of a form of jewellery, looped neck rings, and that's likely how they started out, as a widespread item worn by wealthy people for decoration and as an indicator of their wealth and status. But the ones found in graves, the ones people wore, were lighter in weight at around 90 grams, and those that are found in hoards, the ring ingots, are kind of roughly made and often still have sharp casting seams from their manufacture that haven't been filed down. And they were made in such large numbers that perhaps they also developed a second function as an ingot of copper, a form made for storage, transport and exchange. The hoops or hooks on the end would have helped bundle them up or tie them onto something. The rib ingots were the other common form of metal artifact they created. They are small, thin, curved, rib-shaped pieces of copper. Like the ring ingots, they were also cast in moulds. You can see why they would be handy things for transporting and exchanging in trade. In fact, there were various forms of ingots created during the European Bronze Age. The earliest, I believe, from Southeast Europe and the Aegean are plano-convex ingots and bun ingots, rounded lumps of copper produced through smelting. Another very famous form is the oxhide ingot, produced by the metalworkers of Cyprus and exported across Europe and the Near East. They were given that name as the classic shape looks like an ox hide spread out, although they could also be rectangular and every variation in between. The corner protrusions likely helped with transportation. They also came in various sizes, some of them could be huge. It also seems some were hacked into chunks, presumably when someone wanted to just trade for say a quarter of one. They could be transported as cargo on ships, carted by oxen or carried by donkeys to their various destinations in stages, until they reached the place of production where the metal could be turned into tools and weapons. So it makes sense that the sophisticated metalworkers and traders of the Central European Bronze Age also developed their own forms of ingots to serve the same purposes. But why then do people say they were used as a kind of money? What even is money, anyway? Well, money can be defined as a medium of exchange that is widely accepted for the purchase of goods and services. Money simplifies transactions by eliminating the need for bartering over unique items, which is obviously inefficient when you get to a certain volume of trade. For something to function as money, there needs to be a few key elements: durability, portability, divisibility, uniformity, and there needs to be a limited or controlled supply. You can have different kinds of money too. Our money today, in the form of coins, notes, or digital money, doesn't have any real intrinsic value. What they call commodity money is different, as the objects themselves also have a value. In the past, a gold or silver coin issued by a central authority had images, symbols, and text on it to guarantee standardized weights and purity. Coins like this were worth the value of their weight in the precious metals they were made from. So if we consider the rib ingots and ring ingots of the Central European Early Bronze Age, do they fit the definition of money? Well, they're durable and portable, of course. They would have been a great way of transferring wealth from one place to another. Bundles of these on a wagon or a boat, for example, would certainly have been easier to transport than their equivalent value in cattle, sheep, or people. And their supply was certainly limited. Copper was useful as it could be turned into tools, weapons, and jewellery, but its production was regulated by the elites who controlled the mines and the people who worked them. The limited supply gave it value. The divisibility of these rings and bars is also clear. They're smaller and lighter than you would think. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And certainly they're lighter than actual ingots seen in the Bronze Age. Those bun ingots, for example, were about 4 up to 10 or even 20 kilograms for larger examples. And the oxhide ingots could be 20 to 30 kilograms. These rings and bars, however, were around 200 grams. Think about the divisibility element of money. Actual copper ingots tended to weigh 20 to 150 times more than each of these bars. This strongly suggests they were made to be divisible into these small units to help facilitate smaller scale transactions. And one of the key arguments that they were money, put forward by this excellent paper, is their relative uniformity. They analysed thousands of the rings and ribs, and also the small early Bronze Age axe blades they're often found with in hoards. It's possible that all these forms were somewhat interchangeable as roughly equal value units. They make the point in this paper that according to research, it's not possible for people generally to determine any difference in weight when you heft one in your hand within a certain range, about 10 grams. And they found that most of the rings were within a range which made them perceptibly identical to a ring weighing 195.5 grams. The range of the bars averaged 10 grams lighter at 185.5 grams. Again though, a person is generally unable to distinguish between two objects of these different weights. Lots of the axes, which are probably smaller and thinner than you would imagine, averaged 206 grams. Not every axe in circulation was made to be money though. It seems like the money axes were made of a specific kind of copper alloy that had high ratios of arsenic, antimony and nickel, which gave them a silvery colour and perhaps made them less suitable for actual use as axes. There would have been some incidental standardisation due to the reuse of casting moulds for certain items, but many rings and ribs also show small adjustments to their weight after casting by the addition of a small piece of metal. Some have wire wrapped around the end of a ring, or as is often the case with the ribs, an additional lump of copper was cast onto it. It's like they were doing their best to achieve a standardised weight. Imagine you're a Bronze Age trader presented with a bundle of these and they all look the same and they all feel the same. They're basically identical and any small differences would average out anyway. By the way, there were weighing systems in use across Middle and Late Bronze Age Europe, again reinforcing the relative sophistication and standardisation of the trade networks in this era. I find this stuff fascinating, but I never know what other people find boring or interesting, so if you'd like to see a video on Bronze Age weights, please let me know in the comments below. Anyway, the idea of ribs, rings and axes as somewhat interchangeable money is reinforced by the finds that show them bound up together to create larger units. This research suggests that initially one ring or rib corresponded to one axe, while later on in the era 3 rings or ribs were needed to make 2 axe blades. After that, the axe sizes grew so large and varied that there was no longer any relationship. They also believed that axe blades were likely only used as commodity money in the more marginal areas outside the core chiefdoms, on the outer edges of where the rings and bars circulated. They are also found in hoards clustered in groups of 5 and 10, suggesting a decimal counting system. Amazingly, they've also found multiple bundles of 5 rings and also bundles of 10 rings that have collective weights of around 1,000 grams or 1 kilogram. And from the research on weight systems, it looks like the Bronze Age European base weight unit might have been around 10 grams. Quite remarkable that the modern metric system was a development of the scientific standardizations of the Enlightenment, and yet the decagram and kilogram just happened to align with the system, perhaps in use 3,000 years earlier. As the authors of this paper conclude, quote, "There can be no doubt that at least the rings and ribs conform to the definition of commodity money. Our analysis revealed perceptible similarity in weight between rings, ribs, and a selection of axe blades from the early Bronze Age of Central Europe. We take this to be evidence of intentional standardization that follows from lifting objects and estimating their weight by hand, attesting for their use as commodity money. Standardization occurred around a weight of 195.5 grams, though this is not an absolute benchmark. It is unlikely that this exact weight was aimed for. Rather, the similarity in weight is the result of a rule of thumb corresponding to the material realities of casting metal in moulds and commodification." End quote. So what might have happened is that between about 2200 and 1900 BC, the Únětice culture produced so many copper axes and necklaces for the rulers that they ended up being stored in their halls. They were a way to accumulate and store wealth, and they were used as commodity money. Because of this, special kinds of axes, and especially rings, started to be cast specifically to serve this function. After about 1900 BC, the bars started to be cast and were in use along with the rings, while axes were only used as money in peripheral regions. After 1700 BC, new, smaller bars weighing less than 100 grams started to be made. This might be because the Únětice culture was now in a decline that led to crisis and collapse. The huge changes of around 1600 BC were seen in many places, not just Central Europe, but whatever the reason for these changes, this system of early metal money came to an end. Copper production declined, and more scrap metal began to circulate instead. The early Bronze Age money system would be replaced by systems of weights used with balances that became widespread in Middle and Late Bronze Age Europe. You could cut up any piece of copper and weigh it on balances to ascertain its value. It would be another 1,000 years or so before coins started being developed in Western Anatolia, and that would be an idea that really caught on, so much so that it never went away. Not yet, anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, the sources are listed in the description. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members. By supporting this channel, you get exclusive content and ad-free videos. The links to join us are in the description below. Now please watch this video all about the incredible proto-state society of Bronze Age Central Europe, the Únětice culture. Thank you for watching.